I'm just trying to remember what I was going to say.
It's been going for about a minute now.
All right, guys. I want to go ahead and get into one of my most interesting and favorite builds that I'm working on right now. Behind me, I've got a 2016 Dodge Charger. Normally, nothing special about it, right? RT, SRT, Hellcat, Demon, right? Obviously, changes in motors, changes power, torque levels, right? That's typically what you'd find. In this particular case, I want to start a pretty comprehensive understanding of what makes this particular Dodge Charger special, at least in my mind, which is all-wheel drive. All-wheel drive obviously is benefiting in adverse conditions, but specifically in this case, I'm looking for additional traction. Chargers, Challengers, all the LDLX platforms have always suffered with these increasing trim levels to be able to actually hook that power to the ground, especially when you do bolt-ons, superchargers, nitrous, things like that. It's really important to try and understand not just widening the car, which is a very common thing nowadays, especially on these Challengers and Chargers. That's why they've come out with the wide body kits, but also trying to get all-wheel drive if possible. So there's been a few YouTubers looking at this. I know, Hellcat all-wheel drive Challengers. A lot of the folks based on Trackhawk or Durangos have been a common setup to do swaps. I think Junkyard Dave and a few other folks have been looking at that. In this particular case, the refresh of the Dodge Charger starting in 2015, they don't, to the civilian population, offer here in the United States the all-wheel drive package. They used to between the first generation remake and the second generation remake up to 2014. Those powertrains are a little bit different, and we'll kind of get into that as this build progresses and we get into more detail here on this powertrain. But regardless, this is a 2015 and up to 2020 all-wheel drive police interceptor, specifically the model with the 5.7 liter or 345 cubic inch Hemi Gen 3 motor. That's the key to be able to make this kind of build work. They obviously make GT and SXT all-wheel drive Chargers and Challengers now, but those are always equipped with the 3.6 or 3.7 liter Pentastar Chrysler motors. Obviously V6, so you're pretty much capped on what you can do in terms of performance. Now, like I said, the 5.7 liter motor comes standard in the all-wheel drive police interceptors for this model. I ended up picking up this specific cop car, although it was not actually ever in police service. It was used basically as a development car by a company, and I ended up picking it up for a great deal, and it only had 16,000 miles on it when I grabbed it. And so we'll kind of get into that a little bit, but I kind of want to go and overview, now that we know a little bit of what this is, specifically why you might do this. And so again, this is a 2015 to 2020, or the third generation of the remake of the Dodge Charger by Chrysler. The specific option is the police interceptor model with the 5.7 V8 package. So the stock 5.7 liter motor would end up using would end up outputting about 380 horsepower, 395 foot-pounds of torque. So by itself is very capable. Unfortunately, the LDLX platforms do suffer from rather excessive weight because of the platform that they've been based on for a long time. So always trying to maintain the weight of the vehicle and reduce that is quite important. So we'll definitely be getting into that during this build as well. But regardless, I ended up picking this with about 16,000 miles on it. And so why might you try and get into this? Well, again, the police Chargers specifically in certain variations offer all-wheel drive, which are not common on the civilian models. So again, the RT, Scat Packs, things like that, although you can certainly get larger model motors in them, they will ultimately suffer. And so unless you do a wide body, and even then, very high horsepower applications, it's going to get difficult unless you tub the vehicle, throw in a 4-link, etc., and it's specifically meant for drag to be able to get traction to the ground. So all-wheel drive is a great alternative to that. And so The nice part about these Dodge Chargers, the police versions, is they share about 90% of the parts with the commercial, the consumer versions of the car. Really, when we get down to it, the front subframe, the cradle that actually holds the motor, and we'll show that here in a second, is a little bit differently set up. Obviously, the electronics package is set up to be able to understand traction control and ABS sensors to be able to assist the traction from rear to back of the vehicle to, primarily the point of the addition was for adverse conditions, so snow, rain, slick or otherwise gravel roads kind of thing. But regardless, the hardware that we'll look into definitely provides that advantage, and we'll start to understand what it takes to be able to actually build the powertrain to be able to hold a lot more power. So why would you want to try and do this compared to just getting a Scat Pack or a Hellcat, right? Well, again, traction really comes to mind. The other thing is you can pick up a lot of the police chargers now for quite a discount from auction sites, etc. And so being able to snatch one of these, again, the trim levels interior, you'll kind of see, and I'll go through, are on the lower SXT or RT levels. But that being said, the nice part about more modern vehicles is a lot of the wiring and a lot of the modules are there to be upgraded. That's how they end up making these vehicles. And so trying to add in a new touchscreen or add in a new climate control, those kind of things can be done with scanners and other tools electronically, and then ultimately you just need that additional hardware. So essentially getting these for cheap is a viable option, even if you don't want to try and make a horrendous big horsepower build or something. Just being able to have one for everyday kind of driving use. They are quite economic between the V6 and the 5.7 motors. They certainly have advantages. Hemi's been using the multi-displacement system for a while. On the lower trim, the 5.7s and the 6.4s in the trucks. And so you do get some pretty good gas mileage numbers on highway, if that's what you're into, is a more economic daily driven car. In this particular case, I ended up getting this one really for steal with 16,000 miles on it, a 2016 model year. I ended up picking it for about 13 grand. And so you can definitely find good deals out there. Depending on the situations, et cetera, where you're at in the world, it might be a little bit more difficult, but it's one of those things that you just got to be tenacious about. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get into the specifics of the all-wheel drive Charger behind me and understand how we're going to make this into one heck of a high horsepower and fun vehicle to drive. So let's get into it.
With my head again, you had your heart set on me, but these feels, they come and go, and they come so easily. Tell me what it is about you that I can't forget, but you're breaking down my walls again, just to set me free. Why do I, baby, why do I love the way you are, we always leave me? Why do I, baby, why do I love the touch but never love the feeling? Why do I, baby, why do I love the way you are, we always leave me? Why do I, baby, why do I love the touch but never love the feeling?
All right, guys, so I've got the entire drivetrain of this now modified Dodge Charger Police in front of me. But before we get into the actual hardware, I want to go over a little bit of the theory behind the all-wheel drive in this particular vehicle and in general where it kind of lends from in previous designs. So starting at the front, we've obviously got in this model the 5.7 liter Gen 3 Hemi motor. So this is an overhead valve V8 configuration. Generally speaking, in a rear-wheel drive car, right, you would just have the engine attached to some kind of transmission, manual or automatic, directly attached to a drive shaft, and then a rear differential. Very common, very American muscle oriented, right? Very easy to kind of handle, otherwise has some drawbacks, especially with the motor in the front, right? But regardless, that's not where we're at. We're talking about all-wheel drive. So in this particular model of Dodge Charger, we've got the same 5.7 liter Hemi that would be found in any of the other RTs or consumer cars, but specifically it's using a very, I would say, unique all-wheel drive system that was, I think, regionally kind of pushed with a lot of the Nissan, Datsun GTR lines, specifically the kind of general ATISA system where you have a biased rear torque transfer, which usually 100% in the rear after initial takeoff or generally, you know, at higher speeds, right? But in that specific configuration, we have the engine up front. We have some kind of pass-through oil pan where a differential is attached directly to the oil pan or to the motor with a cross axle going from either side to attach the front wheels. Directly after the engine, we've got the transmission of some variety again. In this particular case, it's an automatic 5-speed NAG1 or WA 580, 530. Directly after that is the center differential. So a lot of different names for that. In this particular case, we usually call it a transfer case. So what it's doing is it's taking and splitting the torque from the back of the transmission in two directions. And how it splits the torque is the unique case that, again, borrows from some of the Nissan GTR applications with ATISA. So either using a hydraulic fluid or in this case, an electromagnetic coupler or piston, it's actually changing a clutch inside of the transfer case attached to the secondary drive system, in this case for the front differential, and changing how much of the torque is actually being transferred front to back. And so that's where you can get a bias or ultimately split the differential. In this specific case, the transfer case or center diff is a BorgWarner 4440 unit. They've been around for a little while now. These are actually pretty stout units for the vehicles, as long as you pay and understand how these are made and what things could be upgraded. After that, very similar, same as a rear-wheel drive car. So we've got usually a shorter rear drive shaft attached to a differential. In this case, the rear differential is actually the same that you would see in any of the normal Charger or Challenger cars, with a couple of different options for gearing. The big thing to pay attention to is that you have to have the same gears in the differential or same final drive ratio is what's called in the rear differential and in the front differential. And so this other power transmission scheme here in blue, we actually have a drive shaft that moves that front differential attached to the side of the 5.7. Usually it's a little bit smaller. That's where it gets complicated to be able to package into a normal kind of vehicle, simply because you have to stuff that in and around the suspension, the frame, and the engine and oil pan itself. And so usually on bigger motors, it's a little bit more difficult. On small displacement motors, it's a little bit easier, but when you get to larger American V8s, it certainly can become troublesome in terms of the engineering design behind that vehicle. But regardless, the key here is that the final drive ratio between the rear and the front differentials have to be the same so that the rotation of the actual wheels and tires themselves matches. Otherwise, you're going to start slipping in the front or the rear and causing potentially mechanical damage in one of these torque zones, whether it be the transfer case most commonly, or one of the differentials is actually transmitting power. And so that's very key. Same with the actual size of those tires is something that has to be monitored as well. But regardless, so that rear differential, same as what you would see in a Challenger or Charger, In this case, this actually came with a 3.07 to 1 final drive ratio. We're actually going to be upgrading that as well to a limited slip differential. It's about 230 millimeters in diameter for that major ring gear. That ring gear is typically used to gauge how much power something might be able to take. There's obviously other factors in that, but ring gear size is certainly a good estimate on what a particular differential might do. Up front, obviously, again, smaller. This is 180 millimeter and actually a little bit off on that front final drive ratio, but there is a tolerance band of about 1 to 2% between those final speeds on each axle. In this case, it's also an open. Front differentials are usually open because those wheels are turning at different rates, usually at a more constant capacity, and so if you're turning the wheels or you're making a hard turn, usually there's going to be need for most slip. That's why most consumer cars end up having an open front differential. Regardless, it's something that we'll be looking into as well. The main key here to make an all-wheel drive system work in this kind of a TISA style is how the car senses to be able to change torque from the front to the rear. So in this case, we have a controller of some kind monitoring the wheels at each corner of the vehicle, so front and back, right and left, and it's looking at the wheel speed of those and determining if a slip condition occurs, whether it be from ice, snow, or actual traction slip because of power, then it's going to try and change this center differential or transfer case, how much the clutch inside of it on the secondary shaft is engaged to either apply more torque to the front or less torque to the front, depending on what's done. Now, in the BorgWarner 4440, the fixed power ratio is actually not 50-50 as in some of these, like STI or Subaru cars, right? It's actually a 32-68 split. So generally speaking, 40 to 60 split. Actually, yeah, I think that's right. 40 to 60 split is generally what we call it, but usually around that. The 38 to 62 split is what I meant to say. Regardless, the front differential, if it needs more power, the transfer case and the transmission ends up sending it more, so that the front wheels, in this case, because it's an open differential, maybe only one would be engaged. Regardless, you're able to get more power to that front to be able to get out of a limited slip situation. In terms of performance, this is very advantageous because the rear power is usually the most in a starting line or drag race application. So if those wheels begin to slip, then the car will lose traction and you'll fishtail, or otherwise you're going to be losing momentum during that acceleration. And so being able to provide some of that power to the front is key for a good hard launch. The rest of the system ends up monitoring real time at a very high rate, and understanding that ultimately in this all-wheel drive configuration, that power at some point is going to be moved from that 38-62 split all the way to 100% in the rear, or close thereof, 100% in the rear. And that is, again, to give the driver the most confident and easy sensation of driving, whether it be on a track or just around twisty, windy roads. That usually a rear-wheel drive configuration not only improves the driving experience, but also usually saves on fuel economy, saves on tire wear, etc. So that's one of the nice advantages originally kind of developed again by a lot of these Nissan all-wheel drive systems, and certainly there's others that exist now that share that kind of platform. So for this particular build, we obviously needed to understand where the weak links were, because the main disadvantage of all-wheel drive system is that there's more moving parts, so there's more potential areas for that to fail, as well as usually in a lot of modern all-wheel drive systems, they're more geared towards benefiting the driver for adverse weather conditions rather than actual performance. And so trying to understand where a part might fail within an all-wheel drive system in some of these modern vehicles is really the key for being able to get high horsepower, high torque numbers into this. So in this particular case, the goal we wanted to do was to ditch this original 5.7 motor and swap in a much larger displacement and a much larger potential V8 motor, again Gen 3 Hemi base, And obviously there's a lot of different flavors to be able to do that. So in this particular case, we're gonna actually end up going with a custom crate motor that we'll be revealing a little while later. But for that specific motor, we intend to run boost. And so one of the more unique ways to go for that now that certainly has its pros and cons is by going with the supercharger rather than typically what's done with a single turbocharger or twin turbochargers. The turbocharger that we're going to be using is a Whipple Gen 5 3 liter that we're going to be looking at here in a little bit. And then the rest of the powertrain obviously has to be built to be able to take that. And there's a couple of different ways to actually look at how torque and power is transmitted through the drivetrain, and a few tricks to be able to ensure that something that powerful, you know, when we're talking, you know, 1,000 or over 1,000 horsepower, how you can effectively get that to the ground, even in the case of an all-wheel drive system, because that still by itself may not be enough when you start talking with, you know, very large 4-digit numbers like that. As well as being able to keep that drivetrain alive without too much immediate jerk that could potentially cause a failure in one of these parts. And so the transmission that we have, again, this is a NAG1 5-speed. Most of the modern Dodge cars now have moved to the ZF box 8 speeds. Obviously also very capable transmissions. But the nice part is this NAG1 5-speed is a very capable motor as long as you pay attention to building up certain aspects of it. So specifically the Valvetronic package on the bottom, changing input-output drive shafts, increasing the amount of clutch discs in the automatic transmission, or the type of material in that is certainly key to be able to make a transmission survive more intensive applications, and that's exactly what we've done here. And so we've got a 5-speed redone by Paramount Performance, as well as a custom torque converter. This is an automatic. We need to be able to provide that torque at the most capable time that the engine is going to be outputting, in this case for this Whipple supercharged motor that we're getting. In front of that, actually, so we have this oil pan that the original 5.7 attaches to. This is key to be able to get it to work. And the main thing about the oil pan is you actually have a pass-through where the front drive axles or CV joints to either one of the front left and right wheels has to pass through that, and the differential is usually attached on one side. In this case, again, we've got a 180 millimeter differential on the side, and that is attached with a center CV joint that you can see here. We're actually, in this particular application of an all-wheel drive system, it uses a front disconnect, and that essentially allows the car to completely disengage the front rather than just relying on that center differential. And so you have zero torque actually being transmitted to the front drive system. Also helps with fuel economy as well. And so in this particular case, there's a ring gear that travels over two normal gears and actually locks those together so the torque can be transmitted, and that process is done by an electronic solenoid system controlled by either the computer or the user. And so that's actually what's maintaining the front system of power all on the bottom of a Gen 3 Hemi. As we go to the back of the vehicle, we've got the transfer case, again, a BorgWarner 4440. There's a couple of different things you can actually do to these to build them up. We're working with Paramount actually to look at changing the clutch material, adding additional clutches, changing out the chain on it, as well as you can do some bearing modifications to this. And so certainly the transfer case is usually considered a weak link in a lot of all-wheel drive car applications, but there's again some tricks that we'll get into throughout this build to help better understand how you might be able to save a part like that. On the side of that, we actually obviously have the front differential and how that transfers the actual torque to that that front drive shaft to the front differential. And then behind the transfer case, we have the main drive shaft going to the rear diff. In this case, we actually have a stand-in rear differential from another one of our project cars. But otherwise, same application, usually a larger differential in the back. In this case, it's a 230 millimeter differential. And so those are the primary components. We're going to be upgrading whatever we can, specifically on those drive shafts, going to aluminum or carbon fiber. On the half shafts, those are going to be built as well. We're going to be working with a couple of different folks to try and get those parts made. There's a few different things we can do on the front just to make sure that there's no potential breakage, because if something were to fail on this front drive pan, you would potentially lose all oil, and that would ultimately destroy the motor, which, you know, in terms of building a car and investing that much time and money, certainly isn't good. So being able to make sure that the front drive system, which is usually the weaker form of an all-wheel drive car, is as stout as possible, is certainly going to be key in this build, because at the end of the day, we want to be able to make a lot of power in upwards of 1,000, 1,300 horsepower, and so we're definitely going to get you know, into the nitty-gritty on how to be able to build something that stout, and understand how to leverage the electronics on the system and mechanical systems on the supercharger, on the engine and the transmission, to be able to control that. So yeah, let's go ahead and get more into the build, and we'll check back with you guys. All right, guys, so I want to get a little bit more into the actual transfer case that makes the magic happen in an all-wheel drive car. In this, again, particular case, on the new Gen 2, Gen 3 remake Chargers and Challengers, they're using a Borg-Warner 4440 case. By itself is honestly a very stout transfer case. Compared to the previous transfer case from the Gen 1 remakes, the transfer case is, first off, not completely open, but secondly is a lot more stout in its stock configuration. And we can actually see some of the internals here. So obviously this is the rear output shaft for the main power transfer to the rear differential. Below that, we've got the connector for the electromagnetic coupler that actually changes the clutch engagement that you'll see here in a second. We've got a couple other sensors monitoring temperature, monitoring speed. And obviously the actual mount is attached here on the back. So when we take this guy off, this is actually one of our spare units that we're using for this build. We've got a couple of different moving mechanisms. And so starting off with the main part that allows this to work is actually this electromagnetic coupler that changes based on just a simple PWM signal, the compression of the clutch pack that I'll show you here in a second, and that actually is quite a very simple and easy system to control, and there's a couple different ways you can do that beyond the stock system, but regardless, very simple, very reliable setup to be able to engage this clutch. Whereas you'd see on a GTR or some of these others in the past, they use a hydraulic system, to actually move fluid and engage a clutch of some kind into the rest of the gear set. So we've actually got a pressure plate here, a friction plate or flywheel style that's going in, a couple of different bearings, etc. That are riding on the actual main shaft here. And below that, we've got the entire clutch package. I believe in this particular case, I'm not going to take the whole clutch apart, but we've got about 15 to 18 clutch packs, very similar to an automatic transmission, that are being engaged with the various different modes of the vehicle. So all-wheel drive, in this case with an actual aftermarket tuner called Taser. You can actually fully engage the transfer case or run it completely unengaged in rear-wheel drive mode, and some of those can actually be played with a PWM controller as well. Regardless, depending on how much friction is inputted, that is changed and ultimately driven to the secondary drive for the front differential, and you can see a chain here. You can do a couple different upgrades to the chains on any transfer case, different materials, or you can crowd treat them, as well as the bearings that are on a transfer case, or really any kind of transmission. Those can be upgraded as well. Beyond that, we've got a pickup for oil. This is a self-contained unit. You can add in a cooler for that. To be able to essentially make sure the transfer case doesn't overheat. The hotter usually a transmission or any kind of torque box gets, the more likely a failure may occur. So making sure that parts are well lubricated and stay within reasonable operating temperatures is certainly key to be able to make something last as long as possible. Otherwise, the system's really rather robust for a typical weight street vehicle. So again, this is about a 4,000 pound car. As that's scaled with power, certainly you want to try and upgrade this, beyond 1,000 horsepower or something like that. Definitely, you need to look at those kind of things in more in larger vehicles, so like the Trackhawks and some of the others, the transfer case is physically larger, and so that's what's made people prefer those. So they usually don't have to worry about upgrading a transfer case or worrying about that. And it usually just comes down to there's more stout parts, the chain's bigger, the gears are bigger, there's more clutch surface, those kind of things. Otherwise, you just have to pay attention to it. And so this is kind of just an in-depth overview of what an actual transfer case looks like, and specifically on this Borg Warner 4440, how it actually works. So the all-wheel drive Charger build is something that has not really been covered in much detail, with the exception that there has been a few YouTubers and other fabrication groups that have kind of inspired me over the years to do a main build for this. Specifically, I know Dos Lamos, he's one of the first to look at supercharging and actually modifying a second-gen remake Charger. I believe his ended up getting a Pro Charger along with a lot of other supporting mods, made about 500, 600 horsepower all-wheel drive, certainly very capable. One of the others, I know Weston Chaplin, I believe, ended up getting an all-wheel drive police Charger, dropped in a motor. Obviously there were some issues with it from my understanding, and that hasn't really been covered by the viewers very much, but otherwise it has been a little bit covered. But the biggest resource has been one of the SEMA builds put in actually by Gearhead Fabrication and Speedcore, and that was a all carbon fiber build that Speedcore had helped fund for an all-wheel drive police Charger. And one of the interesting things is a lot of people think that actually started life as a Hellcat car, and they ended up doing a lot of custom fabrication work, etc. But that was actually an all-wheel drive police interceptor, just like the one behind me, where they ended up modifying a lot of the same drivetrain that we're going to be going into. Specifically, they ended up swapping in a custom a Hellcat motor to power it, since the Gen 3 Henry platform is very similar, and then performing a lot of other modifications, specifically to the transfer case, to be able to make that kind of power in a twin turbo setup actually reliable for street general applications or drag strip, right? And so there's been a little bit of coverage over that over the last few years, but not really getting into what it takes to make an American all-wheel drive car, and specifically a V8 all-wheel drive car, possible with high horsepower stuff. So that's kind of where the background for this project came in. All right, guys, this has been a pretty in-depth overview for the build. We're going to start on this 2016 Dodge Charger Police Interceptor. Obviously, we've got a lot of ambition with getting a really high horsepower all-wheel drive setup in this. We're really excited to get down in the nitty-gritty, understand what it's going to take to build this, changing out parts, changing out the drivetrain, looking a little bit at the controls. Otherwise, it's a very honestly straightforward build and system at the end of the day. And so certainly we're excited to share this and bring some of this content to you. Remember, hit that like and subscribe button. If you've got questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. We're certainly trying to give you guys the best entertainment we can. So we're really excited, and we hope you guys enjoyed.
Okay guys, this is our 2016 Charger build. I'm really excited to share this with you. It's a pretty straightforward build, but it's going to be real tough. So I'm really excited that we're doing this for you.